The Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, the Subcommittee on Energy and Minerals Resources will host an oversight hearing to examine the U.S. Geological Survey's critical minerals list. I'd like to begin by thanking all of the witnesses for being here today for this important hearing. By now, we have all seen the numbers. Demand for hard rock minerals like nickel, cobalt, zinc, silver, lithium, and many other commodities is expected to climb rapidly in the coming years. Our modern way of life relies on these resources for satellites, cell phones, defense systems, and virtually all other high-tech devices. Luckily, here in the United States, we are blessed to have some of the most prolific deposits of hard rock minerals, including the district that I represent in northeastern Minnesota, which will power our 21st century economy forward. I use the term hard rock minerals, which includes nearly all mineral commodities except hydrocarbons and aggregates. However, since the Trump administration's 2017 executive order, the term critical minerals has been used for a subset of these minerals. We now have the critical minerals list, which is created and overseen by the U.S. Geological Survey at the Department of the Interior, also known as USGS. We discuss the importance of mining and minerals in this committee often, as we should. But what exactly is a critical mineral compared to other hard rock minerals? Are there tangible benefits to being listed as critical, such as increased access to funding, higher prioritization by federal permitting agencies, or protection from frivolous lawsuits brought by activists and interest groups? If so, what happens to those mineral commodities that are not listed? I am also interested to hear about the similarities and distinctions between the USGS critical minerals list and the recently released critical materials list published by the Department of Energy. It's important to fully understand how these lists differ. If minerals benefit in different ways from being on one list or the other, and if there are any considerations given to the DOE list that the USGS might incorporate into its own analysis. Finally, we need to understand the impact of these decisions on domestic mining projects. We will hear testimony today about how investments in a mineral-rich state, like my home state of Minnesota, can be affected by federal decisions about which minerals are considered critical and how changes to the list can bring uncertainty to economic development. One would reasonably assume that if a particular mineral is listed on the critical minerals list, the administration would prioritize domestic access to and development of it. As we begin the hearing today, I am once again struck by the hypocrisy of this administration's policy on domestic mineral production. On the one hand, the administration advocates for increased renewables and EV mandates, policies that will certainly speed up demand for the minerals needed to build them. The White House has even provided billions of dollars in taxpayer funds for midstream and downstream mineral production. But on the other hand, we have seen this administration repeatedly choose to lock up lands with high mineral potential across our nation, such as the 225,504 acres withdrawn from development in Minnesota this past January in the Duluth Complex, the biggest copper-nickel find in the world. Just last month, the administration created a new national monument outside the Grand Canyon, blocking access to some of the richest uranium deposits in the United States. For that matter, I am very curious why uranium was listed as a critical mineral in 2018 version of the list, but for some reason it no longer qualified just a few years later for the 2022 list under this current administration. I hope this policy change was not political, but given this administration's anti-mining agenda, I am skeptical. For the sake of our country, I strongly urge the administration to accept that shutting down domestic mining while increasing demand at the same time will lead the United States to disaster. This administration must drop its anywhere but America, any worker but American anti-mining agenda. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join me today in a robust and meaningful discussion of the critical minerals list and any potential changes that will help put the United States into the greatest position possible to meet future challenges to our supply chain and our national security. Thank you again to the witnesses for their willingness to join us today and share their testimony. I now yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairman Stauber. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us this morning to discuss the U.S. Geological Survey's critical minerals list. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. Recognizing the foundational role many minerals play in our economy, Congress has recently tasked USGS with creating and regularly updating a list of critical minerals. These are minerals that are deemed essential to U.S. economic or national security and are vulnerable to supply chain disruption. These critical minerals will play a crucial role in our clean energy transition. For example, we use lithium, cobalt, and nickel, among many other minerals, in batteries for electric vehicles, in wind turbines, and solar panels, all renewable energy technologies that will help us end our reliance on polluting fossil fuels and stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis. Critical minerals will be especially important for the transition of our transportation sector. Transportation is currently the #1 source of carbon emissions in the United States, which makes this sector crucial to decarbonizing quickly. An important aspect of electrified transportation is demand for minerals, and the most non-replaceable critical mineral for electric vehicle batteries is lithium. Now, I'd like to use lithium as a prescient example here. Lithium is already a bottleneck in the global and domestic supply chains for electric vehicles, or EVs. Today, there is only one operational lithium mine in the entire United States. Most of our lithium is currently imported from countries like Chile and Argentina. And our demand for lithium is only expected to skyrocket in the coming decades. Studies show that if today's demand for electric vehicles is projected outward, the global demand for lithium will increase 42 times by 2040. The vast majority of this new demand will be driven by the United States. If demand for EVs continues at our current pace, the lithium requirements for the US EV market alone in 2050 would require triple the amount of lithium currently produced on the entire planet today. Corporate interests and their allies in Congress see this potential for astronomical demand and point to it as a reason for cutting our bedrock environmental protections, ignoring community input, and abusing vulnerable communities among our international trade partners. These private interests and their allies will say that we need to spark a rush to the bottom in order to compete with China, that we can't afford our 200-year-old mining law, they'll say, because China's mining regulations are weaker, that we can't afford to pay union wages to US auto workers, they'll say, because Chinese auto workers already make less. And essentially, major corporations are asking us to engage in a global race to the bottom because when they drive costs down, they profit. But they use those profits to then surge and skyrocket their own CEO pay and not drive costs down, but to drive them up. These race to the bottom arguments prey on a fear of scarcity that is emotionally appealing. But like so many arguments based in fear, this is a false choice. For one, these arguments fail to acknowledge the work the United States can do in other sectors to reduce our reliance on these minerals in the first place. A recent study by UC Davis and the Climate Community Project shows that by increasing mass transit options, bringing EV batteries in line with other nations, and creating a robust battery recycling system, we can reduce our dependence on lithium by as much as 92%. In a world where lithium is hard to come by, these reforms would have huge advantages for our energy and economic security. Race to the bottom arguments also ignore a painful legacy when it comes to mining. Namely, we must recognize that to this day, mining disproportionately harms indigenous communities in the United States and across the globe. In the US, 97% of known nickel deposits 89% of copper, 79% of lithium, and 68% of cobalt, all critical energy transition minerals, are within 39 miles of tribal lands. And unfortunately, mining on public lands in the US is still governed by the long outdated mining law of 1872, which lacks provisions for tribal consultation, environmental safeguards, permitting requirements, or even royalties, so American citizens can see even a return on these publicly owned resources. But the clean energy transition is an opportunity to reimagine our supply chain, from mineral extraction all the way to end use. And we do not need to choose between sacrifice zones and creating jobs. Using nonpartisan data from the USGS, we can improve mineral efficiency, increase recycling, and build economic security. We can require meaningful consultation with tribes. We can work in partnership with organized labor to build family-sustaining union jobs in mineral processing and manufacturing. And lastly, we can develop trade policy that holds our global partners accountable to the same environmental and labor standards established here, so that businesses have no incentive to leave the US for cheaper labor or resources. It won't be easy, and I firmly believe that with a coordinated whole-of-supply chain approach, we can reduce demand, prevent environmental and cultural harms, and uphold Indigenous sovereignty while enforcing strong labor standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ranking Member Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for the hearing, and thank you. Let me join in thanking the witnesses for being here today. The USGS critical minerals list determines which minerals are important for our national and economic security. But what's often left out of that determination is the damage that mining for these critical minerals causes, especially for tribes and other vulnerable communities. As we have seen over and over, our outdated mining law of 1872 doesn't have the appropriate or necessary safeguards in place to protect these communities and the public engagement that is necessary. Mining has repeatedly destroyed public lands and nearby communities, our environment as well, our public health, and our sacred and special places. With that in mind, we need to think very carefully about how we use the critical minerals list. Some of my colleagues think this list is a free pass to open new mines and rush through or ignore environmental reviews and public input. But doubling down on the mining industry's free-for-all is simply not a viable solution. Advancing environmental justice, strengthening tribal and community engagement, and ensuring a fair return for taxpayers is imperative. There are no royalties collected from mining at all, and that alone is reason enough to deal with the mining law of 1872. We are premising all discussions on a law that is 150 years old, outdated, not part of this century, and the conflicts that come from that law. It's time to modernize it, reform it, bring it up to date, and put in the guarantees and safeguards that is going to make the public believe that truly they are part of the decision making. As it stands now, they are not. In fact, just yesterday, the Interior Department-led interagency working group on mining reform released a report informed by more than 26,000 public comments that includes 65 recommendations to do exactly that, to advance environmental justice, to strengthen tribal and community engagement, and assure a fair return for taxpayers. When it comes to critical minerals, we also need to recognize that, yes, we will need certain minerals for our clean energy transition. Which minerals, in what amounts, and from what sources are far from set in stone. What is critical today may not be critical tomorrow. Demand and a critical status can change quickly, but the mines cannot. Mines take years to start producing, and they cannot simply change the type of minerals they produce when the critical minerals list changes. The legacy of environmental and cultural harms created by mines lasts long past the actual life of the mine. That's why we must be more careful with where and how we mine, and not less careful. We must also take a holistic approach to addressing the risks identified by the critical minerals list. That means using our powers as Congress to promote efficient use and recycling of minerals for the benefit of the environment and communities. What we should not do is consider every single change to the critical minerals list as an excuse to impulsively open a bunch of new mines whenever and however the industry wants. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Westerman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. The people in this room know that we will need to mine 6 times more in the future than what we mine today to meet our mineral demands. This demand is increasing at a greater and greater rate the more this administration and international bodies prioritize renewable energy technologies. I think where we're blessed is the fact that the United States has many of these commodities in our geology, but our national strategy to develop them seems to be all over the place. Over the past 30 years, we have allowed refineries and processing facilities to close and let federal bureaucracy sink our mineral production into a quagmire of red tape and predatory litigation. Instead, we have become increasingly reliant on imports from other countries to meet our mineral needs, many of whom are not allies of the United States. Our mineral dependency is now threatening our future. Over the August break, like many members of Congress, I spent a lot of time in my district. I've got a couple of nuclear power plants in my district that I visited, and as we were wrapping up, I asked them, where do you get your uranium pellets? They immediately said 100% from Russia. 100% of 40% of the energy in my state is dependent on uranium pellets from Russia. To me, that's unacceptable, and we can do better than that. We've got deposits of uranium. Unfortunately, the next day, the Biden administration put our most valuable uranium deposits in an off-limits zone where we can't mine them. That makes absolutely no sense to me. The problems are clear, but the solutions seem to, for some reason, be complicated. In an attempt to identify the most vulnerable supply chains, the U.S. Geological Survey has put together a list of minerals they deem critical. This was a helpful way to focus our nation's attention on the issue, and I appreciate the effort to quantify such a complex issue. However, many questions remain about how effective this list has been in actually reducing our national dependency. Further, I would like to consider ideas to improve the list methodology so that we can best capture changing demand trends with the highest accuracy possible. The critical minerals list is binary, and what I mean by that is a mineral either makes the list or it doesn't. Looking at minerals in this way as either critical or not critical has its limitations, obviously. I would like to consider the value of different approaches, such as incorporating forecasting into the list-making process, or looking at supply chain vulnerability on a sliding scale. Some of the supply chains we're looking at can change radically with one global event, and the critical minerals list needs to be nimble enough to respond to account for such changes. Finally, we have to remember that the critical minerals list exists in the context of domestic mining policy overall. Just yesterday, we finally received the Interagency Working Group's report on mining reform. I regret that many of the administration's policy recommendations will take us even farther from mineral independence. The Biden administration can talk about the importance of mineral development all they want, but when they recommend an ill-advised conversion to a leasing system, high royalties, and putting mineral-rich areas off limits to development, their actions are speaking louder than their words. For both sides of the aisle and for all Americans, ensuring a stable supply of mineral resources is essential for our national security and future economic well-being. A thorough examination of the USGS critical minerals list, why some minerals are on it and others are not, and how it might be improved, is a necessary piece of that puzzle. I look forward to a robust discussion on this extremely important topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will now move to introduce our witnesses. Each witness will have 5 minutes to make their opening statements. Our first witness is Dr. Nadal Nassar, who serves as Chief of Minerals Intelligence Research, U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia. Dr. Nassar, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Staubert, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the U.S. Geological Survey's critical minerals work. My name is Nadal Nassar, and I'm the Chief of Mineral Intelligence Research at the U.S. Geological Survey. The USGS provides the nation's data on domestic and global mineral commodity supply chains. Under the Energy Act of 2020, the USGS analyzes those data in coordination with other federal agencies to develop a whole-of-government list of critical minerals. The analysis identifies commodities for which supply risk is elevated, including how the supply risk has changed over time. It also identifies bottlenecks in supply chains, quantifies import dependencies, and highlights industries that may be most vulnerable to supply disruptions. The 2022 list of critical minerals identified gallium as having the greatest U.S. supply risk, a risk that has become a reality as a result of recent export controls imposed by the People's Republic of China on gallium and germanium products. Gallium is, of course, important to semiconductors that are used in telecommunications, including 5G cellular networks, consumer electronics, solar photovoltaics, electric vehicles, and defense applications. Our data indicate that in 2022, the People's Republic of China produced 98% of the world's primary gallium, 98%. Over time, we expect the list to evolve. The Energy Act of 2020 requires that the list be updated once every 3 years. As supply chains are diversified and strengthened, commodities may come off the list. Similarly, commodities may be added to future lists if their supply becomes less secure or the U.S. economy becomes more dependent on them. The methodology for developing the list will also continue to evolve as we gather additional data and develop better tools to anticipate and quantify supply and demand disruptions and their impacts. Since the release of the most recent list of critical minerals, the list and its underlying analyses have informed some of the nation's largest investments in mineral commodity supply chains. These include recent Defense Production Act investments and bipartisan infrastructure law critical mineral provisions focused on multiple supply chain stages. USGS data and analyses are informing partner agencies' decision-making for a number of these investments. Within the USGS, we are accelerating the Earth Mapping Resource Initiative's assessment of areas with potential to contain critical minerals, both still in the ground and in waste streams. Under the Energy Act of 2020, the USGS also uses the list of critical minerals to help prioritize mineral resource assessments. The USGS analyzes supply chains across sectors, which allows us to understand cumulative supply risks. For example, we examine cross-sectoral demand for mineral materials needed for energy, transportation, and construction, and quantify the economic impact a supply disruption may have on mineral-consuming industries, the ripple effects on the downstream industries that rely on them, and the economy as a whole. We provide these analyses and data to a variety of federal decision makers, including the Defense Logistics Agency stockpile managers, the National Security Council, the State Department, the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the intelligence community. Over the past several years, our data have provided evidence of supply chain disruptions in mineral commodity production and shipping attributable to the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, regional conflicts, as well as export restrictions imposed by trading partners. We continuously monitor the effects of such disruptions across the suite of mineral commodities that we track. The Energy Act of 2020 also calls for the USGS to further develop its forecasting capability. Accordingly, the USGS has expanded the range of official statistics reported annually in the mineral commodity summaries and are developing a new series of mineral outlooks. The President's 2024 budget request proposes to further increase the speed and responsiveness of USGS scenario modeling capabilities. In summary, the USGS provides cross-sectoral, demand-driven analyses that inform whole-of-government efforts to strengthen supply chains. The list of critical minerals is one tool to identify concerns and inform actions. The list and the underlying analyses provide a rich set of data and tools that can be used to better understand the specific risks affecting individual technologies, industries, and commodities originating from a particular geographic region or trading partner. The information can help policymakers target interventions that will increase the security of our nation's mineral commodity supplies. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Our next witness is Mr. Reed Blakemore. He is the Director of Research and Programs for the Global Energy Center with the Atlantic Council based right here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Blakemore, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stauber and Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, and thank you to the distinguished members of the subcommittee for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Reed Blakemore, and I am the Director of Research and Programs at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank headquartered here in Washington, D.C. Before I begin, I'd like to note that my remarks and written testimony represent my observations as an expert and do not necessarily represent the views of my colleagues or institution. To summarize my more detailed testimony, I'd like to provide a broad overview of our understanding of what makes a mineral critical and how we should approach a global economy increasingly dependent on an ever-diverse set of minerals and materials. As many of my colleagues today will reiterate, and has been reiterated by the Chairman and Ranking Member, many minerals, many of which are supply constrained, are fundamental to strategically important industries of the United States, such as defense, energy, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. Access to these minerals is essential to limiting inflation, our global economic leadership, and our national security. The security of supply for such minerals has been strategically relevant to the United States for some time and will continue to be so. Nonetheless, as has already been noted, the rapidly expanding mineral requirements of the energy sector are reshaping how much attention is needed to secure these supply chains. These demands are not only reframing how we think about energy security, but new energy technologies, opportunities for exports and additional economic leadership. Resource security is critical to enabling this leadership in emerging sectors such as electric vehicles and renewable power. Importantly, the United States is not alone in observing this shift. Allies, partners, peers, and rivals are moving quickly to seize the strategic value of influence in mineral supply chains, exacerbating geopolitical risk and supply concentration, which have long been features of minerals markets. For instance, and just one example here, through tariffs and export bans, many mineral-rich countries are enacting policies to push investment towards value-added economic activities so they can capture the economic windfall opportunities beyond simply extracting raw materials for export. This shapes how we need to think about supply chain intervention and securing our resources moving forward for the next 30 years. The risks of inaction here abound. This is why a priority of the U.S. government across consecutive administrations has been to identify specific minerals that it deems critical and focus policy attention on improving access to or the security of these supply chains. Deciding which minerals are critical, of course, is based on dependency, our demand, and the ability to access them reliably, the available supply. However, with 50 minerals now on at least one of the 3 critical minerals lists being produced across the United States government, we would do well to think through the relative criticality of minerals that are designated to this list to mature our strategic planning and act effectively. Though there are a number of mineral-specific factors that apply to this notion, several stand out as useful first steps for consideration. On the demand side, these include the growth rate of specific mineral demands over time, the demand elasticity and substitutability of certain minerals, and differing technology deployment scenarios. On the supply side, I applaud the critical efforts of the USGS to improve our knowledge of the resource base. Nonetheless, the supply picture is also increasingly shaped by several additional features, including difficult project economics and or quality declines, lengthy project life cycles and permitting challenges, and new sourcing methods, such as recycling or waste conversion. Contextualizing these features is an appreciation for the vulnerability of supply to disruption, namely trade exposure and supply chain concentration. Provided that the United States cannot supply all of its mineral needs domestically, mitigating these supply risks requires work to build trusted supply chain partnerships that limit the possibility of physical interruptions, market imbalances, and government interventions. This balance defines the space for how we should resolve a particular criticality, which is equally, if not more important, than listing a particular mineral in the first place. To conclude, there are certain minerals that are structurally important to our national and economic security, and our needs for them are diverse, dynamic, and growing. Identifying these minerals signals a need for action and forms the basis for interagency coordination. But while lists are important, we shouldn't rely on lists alone. We need to ensure that our minerals policy does not become overly clerkish, prescribing problems rather than solving them. Capturing the supply-demand dynamism between each critical mineral will illuminate the pathways to build a cohesive mineral strategy. To be clear, many of the foremost issues in our minerals policy stem from a need for broader reform, be it through permitting or deeper international engagement. Nonetheless, a properly curated list helps inform decisions on those fronts. I therefore commend this committee for attention to this issue and look forward to continuing to support its efforts in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm going to yield to Representative Lamborn to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Roderick Eggert, Deputy Director of the Critical Minerals Institute at the DOE Energy Innovation Hub and Research Professor at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado. Colorado School of Mines is a leading center of education for geology and mining engineering and represents the foremost level of academia in this industry. They are on the cutting edge of mineral and mining innovation and are training the next generation of leaders in the mining industry, which we know is sorely needed. Dr. Eggert, we are pleased to have you here representing the mining industry, the Colorado School of Mines, and the great state of Colorado.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, other members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. Let me use my oral remarks to summarize two of the issues from my written testimony. First, let's think about and compare the 2022 USGS assessment with the 2023 Department of Energy assessment and list. So what is the USGS assessment? It's broad in scope, a screening of something like 70 non-fuel minerals and their supply chains in the context of their importance for national security and really overall economic affairs in the country. It's U.S.-centric and asks the question, for what minerals is the U.S. at risk? It's based on data from the present and recent past, so it's only forward-looking to the extent that the indicators themselves provide insight into the future, which, to be fair, some sense of which can be gained from looking at the 10-year trends, which are part of the assessment. Finally, it's a single list with 50 of the 70 elements scored designated as critical. The DOE lists an assessment of critical materials for energy. It's narrower in scope, not surprisingly. It focuses on energy technologies. It's also global in scope in the sense that the question that this assessment asks is, what are the material risks that threaten the development and deployment of energy technologies? It's explicitly forward-looking by incorporating demand scenarios into its analysis, demand scenarios that have two time frames, out to 2025, and then a longer look out to 2035. It presents a more nuanced list. In some sense, it's actually 4 lists of materials. There are critical materials, and then separately near critical materials for both time frames, near term or short term out to 2025, and the medium term out to 2035. So the USGS list is US-centric broad and based largely on the present and recent past. The DOE assessment is energy-centric, narrower, and more forward-looking. So that's my first topic. The second topic, more broadly and philosophically, why have a list? The simple answer, perhaps a statement of the obvious, is to inform public policy, to prioritize things like research and development activities, geologic mapping, market analysis, aspects of commercial policy, such as tax credits and other issues. A more complicated answer. In my view, a list is most useful when it is viewed as an intermediate product rather than the final word. It's really an initial screening and identification of minerals and materials deemed important for further, more detailed assessment in more specific contexts. The danger of a simple list of minerals and materials as either critical or not critical is that it obscures the complexity of criticality, suggesting that criticality is yes or no rather than a continuum of risk and importance. The longer a list is, the less it represents a prioritization, and the less useful the designation critical is. As many have said, if everything is critical, then is anything really critical? Finally, a couple of comments more specifically about the USGS list. The list is long, 50 elements or minerals. The scope is broad, encompassing both national security and economic affairs. Thus, in my view, the primary uses of the list should be two. First, to signal in a very broad way the importance of minerals, their essentiality, and the degree to which they are subject to supply chain risks. And second, to identify specific supply chains for further analysis. Designation as critical should by itself not qualify a mineral or material for special treatment, which should require more in-depth analysis of particular supply chains. In other words, and this is finally, the USGS list should inform but not determine public policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Eggert. I will now introduce our next witness, Dr. Dustin Mulvaney. Dr. Mulvaney is a professor at the Environmental Studies Department at San Jose State University in San Jose, California. Dr. Mulvaney, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Greetings, Chairman Stauber, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, and other members of the Subcommittee on Energy and Minerals. It's a great honor to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation, and special thanks to the committee staff for all their work putting together this hearing. My name is Dustin Mulvaney. I'm a professor of environmental studies at San Jose State University and a fellow at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. This testimony reflects my views and expertise on the topics herein, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my affiliated organizations or anyone but myself. The development and strengthening of supply chains to support metals, minerals, and materials that we will need for decarbonization, green infrastructures, transportation, healthcare, defense is of serious national importance. Supply chain disruptions from bottlenecks, geographic concentration, and trade restrictions in recent years have shown vulnerabilities to the U.S. economy and decarbonization efforts. The dependence on critical minerals of many key technologies to the U.S. economy makes securing adequate supplies crucial to the success of other important public policies, including the 2021 Inflation Reduction Act and the Energy Act of 2020, as well as efforts by states and local governments. The development of a critical minerals list is an excellent starting point for a conversation about how to develop clean energy supply chains responsibly and to the highest possible labor and environmental standards. We need a framework also that brings together both new responsible critical minerals development, but also one that emphasizes circular economy approaches that can augment supplies significantly. To date, much of the conversation and public policy effort is focused on domestic mining, but recycling, alternative extraction techniques, resource efficiency, harvesting materials from waste streams offer significant promise for enhancing the nation's supply of critical minerals and lessening the risks and exposures to supply chain disruptions. These latter activities are more recently gaining attention and policy support, including from this Congress, which is welcome news to those of us who have been working on waste and recycling issues. Now, while we cannot recycle or mine our way out of these challenges, we should be collecting as much of these critical materials from the waste stream as feasible. It seems profoundly wasteful that we would allow critical materials to be landfilled at the same time we talk about the dire economic and national security consequences of a lack of supply and promote greenfield mine development elsewhere. Today in the United States, less than 40% of copper is recycled, only 5% of lithium is recycled, no gallium is recycled, and only small amounts of germanium are recovered and exported for recycling. These are lost resources that we should not be throwing away. I have several suggestions for areas in my experience and understanding that would result in helping make critical minerals supplies less vulnerable, while at the same time safeguarding environmental protection, cultural resources, and respecting Native American self-determination and sovereignty and at the same time creating high-quality, high-road domestic jobs. And I detail these more in my written testimony. But to summarize, building a circular economy on critical minerals should, one, promote more cradle-to-cradle approaches to the critical minerals challenge. Two, develop robust take-back and collection systems to enhance the prospects of recycling. Three, recover more critical materials from waste streams and increase resource efficiency. Four, advance materials science, input substitution, and alternatives to hard rock mining. Five, strengthen tribal consultation. Six, reform the 1872 mining law. Seven, avoid unnecessary groundwater and ecological impacts. Eight, strengthen environmental review. Nine, provide community benefits. Emphasizing these aspects will result in more secure critical mineral supplies, as well as more community acceptance of and consent to mining and extractive industry activities. Taken together, these suggestions will help get more public support for responsible natural resource development, product stewardship policies, and public investments in innovations in material science, increased resource efficiency, and better processing to augment supplies of critical minerals for the U.S. economy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on these important matters.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now yield to Representative Curtis to introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Brian Summers. I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to invite him here. Brian has been the president of the Utah Mining Association, or UMA, since 2019. UMA works tirelessly to ensure that the country has a stable supply of minerals for the U.S. to lead globally in energy and other industries. Brian, it's a delight to have you with us. Thanks for traveling to Washington, D.C.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Congressman, and good morning to Chairman Stauber and Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the committee. I appreciate the invitation to testify in today's hearing. My name is Brian Summers, and I'm the president of the Utah Mining Association, or UMA. UMA was founded in 1915 and represents Utah's hard rock, coal, and industrial mineral mine operators and related support industries. UMA also worked closely with the National Mining Association and other state and regional industry groups. UMA's mission is to advocate on behalf of Utah's mining industry, its workers, and the communities they support. Mining is a critical industry in Utah, contributing $7.7 billion to the state's GDP, supporting nearly 57,000 direct and indirect jobs, and powering Utah's broader economy by producing the coal, which provides 62% of Utah's low-priced electricity. Mining jobs in Utah are family and community-sustaining jobs, with mining salaries averaging 46% more than the average Utah wage. Since Utah's first commercial mining district was established in 1863, 33 years before Utah became a state, Utah's mining industry has labored diligently to develop Utah's vast mineral wealth and provide the mine commodities markets demand. I believe the fundamental reason a hearing like this, a discussion about how and why particular minerals have been deemed critical, is even necessary, is due to interference by bad actors like China, who seek to distort and control commodity markets, and by misguided regulatory burdens, policy decisions, and investment signals by the federal government. A recent report entitled Critical Minerals of Utah, released by the Utah Geological Survey, states, the concept of critical minerals is not new, and in the United States, various lists of commodities and definitions of what qualifies as critical have been developed since the early 1900s. Again, the fact that a hearing like today's is still necessary more than 100 years on is prima facie evidence that making lists, however methodologically sound, is not as useful as letting the diverse demands of free markets, environmental responsibility, operational efficiency, technological innovation, economic security, and national security determine which minerals are critical at any given time. More simply, perhaps we could adopt the definition of criticality put forth by our friends at the National Mining Association, which is that minerals that are unavailable when we need them should be considered critical. Utah provides an example of how, as NMA presciently observed in a comment letter on the original critical minerals list, quote, world events can redefine criticality in an amazingly short period of time, close quote. A 2020 report from the Utah Geological Survey stated that Utah hosts 28 of the original 35 minerals on that original, of the 35 minerals on the original critical minerals list, and had active production of 8 of them. When the U.S. Geological Survey released the revised critical minerals list in 2022, 4 of those 8 critical minerals Utah was producing were removed from the list: uranium, potash, helium, and rhenium. Just 2 days before the revised critical minerals list was published in the Federal Register, Russia invaded Ukraine. In the aftermath of the invasion, global prices for uranium spiked and remained at near record highs as alternatives to uranium supplied by Russia and Russian-aligned countries are explored, especially in light of the greatly diminished capacity of the U.S.'s once thriving uranium mining, milling, and enrichment industries. Prices for potash also spiked after the invasion and have remained high, given that Russia and Belarus account for 41% of global trade in potash, with resulting negative effects on food supply and prices. Ongoing shortages and high prices for helium also continue, putting further strains on the global semiconductor shortage, which began during the COVID pandemic, as semiconductor manufacturing constitutes the second largest use of helium worldwide. Almost in real time, world events was highlighting the criticality of uranium and potash and helium as the USGS was downgrading their critical status. I should also note that Utah is home to the nation's last functioning conventional uranium mill in Mr. Curtis's district, and is also the only state in the union which produces the higher value sulfate of potash, or SOP, which made the exclusion of uranium and potash in the revised critical minerals list especially puzzling to Utahns. There are many other concerns and inconsistencies related to the federal government's designation of critical minerals and its management of the nation's mineral estate, which I hope we can discuss today. These include competing federal mineral and material criticality assessments, such as the Department of Energy's critical materials list and the Defense Logistics Agency's National Defense Stockpile, the accelerated withdrawal of public lands from mineral production during the Biden administration, implications of the fact that many minerals designated as critical are co-located and produced with other minerals which may not share a criticality designation, the severe diminishment of domestic mineral processing, smelting, refining, and other beneficiation capacity over the last few decades, and the federal government's Byzantine and burdensome permitting processes, which are far outside the norm of other allied countries with similar labor and environmental protections, and which discourage capital investment. Again, I urge the committee to consider the idea that any minerals that are unavailable when we need them should be considered critical. There are far too many minerals which are unnecessarily unavailable and constrained because we've neglected our nation's vast mineral resources, our highly trained mining workforce, and our unrivaled capacity for innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Summers, and it's great to see you again. Visiting Kennecott Mine was very, very impressive and very informational for us. Thank you. I'm now going to recognize members for 5 minutes of questions, and I'm going to recognize myself first. Dr. Nassar, I'd like to ask you about the forecasting abilities of USGS. I understand that today you analyze risks for a given mineral using current supply and demand data only, but do not use forecasting to analyze how risks may change in the next few years. How does your current structure address mineral commodities that are predicted by multiple reports and models to have extremely high demand in the future?
Chairman, thank you for that question. You are correct. Our analysis looks at contemporary data regarding current production and demand. But as we have seen recently, our analysis has predictive power, as in the case of gallium. And indeed, our analysis that we started with the National Science Technology Subcommittee on Critical Minerals in a report that we did back in 2016 highlighted that we could have, using the same indicators, identified that rare earths would have been a problem as early as 2001 and cobalt as early as 2010. So these analyses, while using contemporary data, do have predictive power. Now, we are looking at developing our forecasting capabilities, but currently complete data sets in terms of forecasts, reliable forecasts that are internally consistent regarding future supply and demand across all commodities and all industries that we cover currently don't exist.
Well, let's take copper as an example.
Sure.
I'm sure you're aware of the multiple requests to add copper to the critical minerals list, given its increasing demand. The director of the USGS, David Applegate, sent a letter to Senator Sinema declining her request to re-evaluate copper as a critical mineral this past April. However, just in July, the Department of Energy published its list of materials, and copper was included in that list. Can you explain why copper is considered at risk enough to be considered critical material by the DOE, but not sufficiently at risk to be a critical mineral at your agency?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. I'm happy to answer it. Copper is an important mineral commodity not only for the United States, but for the world, and has been since antiquity. While copper is clearly essential, its supply chain risks are mitigated by a large and diverse global supply chain that spans over 50 countries, reliable trade partners, dependable domestic production, and significant recycling capacity that supplies over a third of U.S. copper supply. USGS has and will continue to analyze copper supply and demand. It is a commodity that we study and will continue to invest research and assessments in. And I'm happy to describe, lean on some of the testimony that Professor Eggert mentioned in terms of the differences between the DOE analysis, which is global and specific to
And that's
energy.
going to be, that's a great segue, so thank you. Dr. Eggert, what do you consider to be the most significant difference between the USGS critical minerals list and the DOE critical minerals list, and what do you think the impact of these differences may be?
The key differences are those that I identified in my statement. Narrower in focus, energy technology specific, and forward looking over different time frames. And obviously it makes a difference in terms of what qualifies, although it is noteworthy that both lists, the DOE and the USGS lists, have significant overlap.
Okay. Mr. Summers, do you think the USGS critical mineral list and the methodology for creating such a list is nimble enough to react to changing market conditions and geopolitical events?
Thank you for the question. No, I don't. And I highlighted some of the issues with the critical minerals that were removed from the list in this last go-round and the world events that perhaps made those the removal of those minerals unwise. And I think that a list that's updated every 3 years, again, no matter what the methodology is simply not nimble enough to respond to very quickly changing world and economic events.
What is the value or implication of a mineral being on the critical minerals list for the mining companies that are operating in Utah?
I think that, I mean, to be honest, we haven't seen investment decisions being driven thus far by inclusion or non-inclusion on the critical minerals list. I think that one of the things that we need to highlight here, though, is that again, most of these minerals, that especially the ones where we have major foreign reliance, they're not primary targets of mining. They tend to be co-located with other minerals, and in many cases, these are not minerals that are on the list. As you were visiting the Kennecott, the Bingham Canyon mine a few months ago, that's a copper porphyry deposit, and so yes, it does provide, copper is the primary target, but it also provides gold, silver, molybdenum, and also critical minerals like rhenium and platinum, palladium, and tellurium. And so I think that in many cases you have to make sure that there's a base for a target mineral which can support a very large and complex and capital-intensive mining operation. And also in many cases, that's going to provide some of these minerals that are a little bit harder to extract and maybe not economical to extract on their own.
And then one quick question for Mr. Blakemore. Mr. Blakemore, what is the biggest factor in mineral supply chain vulnerability that is not addressed by the USGS critical minerals list today?
I would suggest it's the assessment of what does that criticality look like by the time we reach 2050, right? As it relates to the technologies we're dependent on in the energy space and beyond. These are all high innovation sectors where the technology is changing, the underlying minerals are changing for many of these technologies, but also the innovations around substitutability and supply chain circularity for certain minerals and materials are also changing. So those features are critical to develop a holistic plan of action in terms of how we both modernize, adapt, and act on any sort of critical mineral list that's being produced, not just by the USGS, but by other parts of the U.S. government at large.
Thank you very much. And my time has expired. I'm now going to request Representative Ocasio-Cortez for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Chairman. And thank you again to our witnesses. It is important for us, I think, as policymakers to understand how the USGS critical minerals list works and, frankly, to communicate this to the public. I think part of our hearings is also an effort in public education on a lot of these different issues. And so I want us to zoom out a little bit and ask Dr. Nassar, in explaining to a layperson, what does it mean for a mineral or a critical mineral to be added to the USGS critical minerals list? What are the implications of that, and what does that mean to the average person?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The simplest way I can put it is that these are commodities for which there's a heightened degree of supply risk, meaning that they are commodities that are not only important, but for which supply may be disrupted in the near future. The benefits of the list is the ease of communication, right? But I think as my colleagues on the panel have mentioned, it is definitely a nuanced issue. There are a lot of concerns with just having a simple binary. We agree with that. We think, and which is why we provide a ranking methodology that prioritizes things. So it's in one sense, it is a way to prioritize both government action and to highlight issues and concerns.
Mm-hmm. And there are also policy implications for a mineral being added to the critical minerals list, correct? There are tax credits, as have been mentioned, and other sorts of policy incentives for investment, for example, through the Infrastructure and Jobs Act.
Correct. So as I mentioned in my opening testimony, other federal agencies have used the critical minerals list as a way to prioritize. Within USGS, we use it also to prioritize our research, which commodities we should focus on. That doesn't mean that we don't look at commodities and do research on commodities that are not on the critical minerals list, however.
Yeah, and I think from a policy perspective, this creates a little bit of a tension where we want to make sure that this list is accurate, that it contains all of the minerals that truly are a priority, but also I think for us, we deal with a profound incentive because it creates a large pressure for people who want to add minerals to this list and have access to some of those perks and benefits. And so we have to make sure that we are having the appropriate amount of minerals on this list while also dealing with, frankly, very real political incentives to pile on things to this list that perhaps may not be necessary. But in addition to that, I also want us to explore further the implications of that. As was mentioned earlier, there are very real needs, of course, for minerals in our economy, everything from EVs to a wide range of different uses. But I do want us to explore a little bit on how we can reduce the need for the intensity of these minerals overall. Dr. Mulvaney, what are some of the ways that we can actually reduce some of these supply chain risks for critical minerals that don't necessarily involve mining? And what are some of the economic and social benefits of developing a circular economy here?
There we go. So recycling and recovery programs in Europe are creating new stockpiles of end-of-life materials that can then be brought back into feedstocks for new materials. So that's one area, is kind of closing the loop on these materials and not letting them get away. We also could substitute for materials. We've seen even recently, cobalt and nickel falling. A few years ago, people were saying 20-fold increase in cobalt needed by, X date. And we've seen those numbers come down quite significantly because of advances in material substitution. So there's less cobalt in the batteries that have cobalt, and then we've seen a lot of companies just go away from cobalt and nickel altogether to the lithium iron phosphate batteries, which created a supply chain crunch, by the way, in the manufacturing sector and caused those battery prices to go up. That was independent of the minerals extraction and all of that. And furthermore, just resource efficiency in general. We make solar panels with less silicon, with less silver, with less glass, less energy, so we can be more efficient with the materials that we use.
Fabulous. And I was wondering as well if you could dig into the current state of battery recycling and other forms of recycling that could potentially reduce our reliance on minerals. How does that comparatively look in the U.S. compared to some of our European counterparts? And what are some of the largest opportunities that you see for investment there?
Europe has had a comprehensive electrical equipment and electronics legislation, and as well as battery recycling policy on across the board for 15, 20 years now. And now the European Battery Directive has just been released that requires, for example, certain amounts of recycled content to be in the battery. That's, I think, very promising for jump-starting those industries. One thing I've noticed, having served on various recycling and waste management boards and things like that, is recycling is pretty volatile also. We recyclers, sometimes paper's worth stuff, sometimes aluminum's worth stuff, sometimes it's not worth anything. And that bounces around too. So rules like that where you have content requirements, how much recycled content is in a battery, for example, can help drive recycling. Batteries, because of their value, we're starting to see that, because of the value of some of those materials, we're starting to see investment in those. We see state laws, for example, that require the recycling of batteries, so that has jump-started many recycling industries, and for example, that are getting located in Nevada, partly because of California's requirements for battery recovery. So we're getting there. We need more federal policy. We've had a lot of federal inaction. The only waste electronical equipment we collect we actually don't collect. The only waste electrical equipment that we require be handled a certain way is just hazardous stuff. So we're landfilling way too much copper, too much lithium, and the benefits of having recycling programs. We've had quite a few fires, for example, at material recovery facilities because of a little battery in a card, like a Hallmark card might have a battery in it, and that goes through a shredder and it causes a fire, causes $5 million worth of damage at a MRF, and that costs taxpayer money and causes public health challenges for people exposed to those fires.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lamborn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to have the Climax and Henderson molybdenum mines in my state of Colorado. I used to represent one of these two mines in my former district lines. They are the only pure molybdenum mines outside of China, and together produce 33% of our entire domestic production. And it's critical for energy and infrastructure projects. The Henderson mine alone is able to recycle 75% of its water, or roughly 2 billion gallons in 2022. And much of this water is even sent to the city of Denver and reclaimed as drinking water. So, Dr. Eggert, while our Colorado mines specifically target molybdenum, it is more often the case that critical minerals are produced as a byproduct of a host mineral. Can you explain the relationship between critical minerals and host minerals, and how important is it to have a robust mining industry for all minerals if we want to harvest critical minerals?
As several people have said, many of the minerals listed as critical are produced as minor byproducts of other things, some of which are not major or listed as critical minerals. It's both a risk, but it's also an opportunity, because in places like the Kennecott Bingham Canyon mine in Utah, for example, there are unrecovered minor amounts of critical minerals that are waiting to be recovered. There are emerging efforts in this regard, and I think they are worthy of greater attention.
Okay, thank you. China recently announced that it will curb the export of gallium, for which they produce the bulk of the world's supply, and germanium, upon which the U.S. is 54% reliant on Chinese exports. These two minerals are critical for semiconductors, solar cells, integrated circuits, fiber optics, and more. The U.S. is more than capable of producing these items domestically, and it's unacceptable not to do so, considering the amount of money and attention we have placed upon microchip production in the last few years. In 1943, U.S. bauxite production, for example, which is the host mineral for gallium, peaked at 6.3 million tons. By 2013, that had dropped to 128,000 tons, which is less than 1% of global supply. Now, China, by the way, is not as environmentally responsible as we are, in my opinion, if we are less dependent on China, this creates a race to the top, bringing production to our shores where we do such a better job. By offshoring production to China, we are poisoning the world as well as endangering our national security. So, Dr. Nasser, if we allow the development of critical minerals in general, would the United States be less dependent on China?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I agree that the U.S. is not a major bauxite producer. In fact, we import quite a bit of our bauxite to produce alumina. And so when we did a quick analysis in terms of the gallium content of the imported bauxite, there's quite a bit in there that potentially could be produced in the United States. And our analysis specifically examines in the latest list country metrics that evaluate how reliable those supplies may be.
On another topic, demand for minerals and metals is expected to drastically increase to meet manufacturing, infrastructure, energy, and national defense needs. The DoD's Logistics Energy Agency provides economic analysis and forecasts for strategic and critical minerals. That's one of the 3 lists that we talked about in your testimony. How does the Defense Logistics Agency's analysis compare to that of DOE or USGS? And are there components of that methodology that USGS could pick up? And I'll start with you, Dr. Eggert. The
Defense Logistics Agency analysis has a much shorter time frame. It evaluates national emergencies of months to several years. It focuses on both military preparedness and essential civilian infrastructure in times of national emergency. It's very detailed. I don't have a lot of insight into it, but it's an example of a narrower focus and a specific type of emergency that's being evaluated.
Dr. Nasser, do you have anything to add to that real quickly?
No, I think that's accurate. I would add just quickly that the USGS provides data for both the Defense Logistics Agency and the Department of Energy to analyze their issues and provide their reports.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate us having this hearing. I come from Nevada as we transition to a clean energy economy, as well as the focus on hard rock mining. We are no strangers to these issues and stand to economically, of course, benefit tremendously from this transition. And so I appreciate us taking the time to really delve into this area in terms of critical minerals. And, I hope that your testimony, I thank you all for being here, will help inform us as we navigate this important transition. Companies like MP Materials are playing an absolutely essential role in securing our clean energy future and shoring up our strategic positioning in the critical minerals sectors. And this is particularly true and concerning in light of the reality that countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and China are currently responsible for up to 70% of the global production of key rare earth elements. As vital as this is, and I agree with Chair Stauber, that we have to onshore production of this, but it's only half of the story. And Professor Mulvaney, I wanted to ask you, is there any reality in which the U.S. would simply be able to just mine our way out of the need for critical minerals? I think it's fair to say, would you agree that a whole of supply chain approach is most effective and efficient and most realistic way to help us achieve this goal?
Yeah, a whole supply chain approach would certainly shore up more minerals, because we're literally letting stuff fall through our fingers a lot. So, yeah.
And back in my state of Nevada, Nevada-born and Nevada-based Redwood Materials is building a battery recycling facility near Reno that is creating 5,000 jobs and will be able to process enough recycled materials to supply 1 million EVs a year. To me, that sounds like a win-win. Would you agree that this not only stands to benefit our environment, but also our economy, this type of approach?
Yes, especially since a lot of those batteries come from California, and I've looked at DTSC data, and that stuff goes all over the country. So, having it closer to California is, I think, a very, and plus in Nevada, I know Nevada has batteries too. I've had read that the cathode material that they're processing has 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as well. So as we recover more materials, often it is the case that they actually are less greenhouse gas intensive and less energy intensive. So benefits in multiple ways, as well as create jobs too.
Thank you. Dr. Nasser, I wanted to turn to Earth MRI. Decreasing the nation's reliance on foreign sources of critical minerals by shining a spotlight on relevant resources in states like my home state of Nevada, and assisting in locating and mapping abandoned hard rock mine sites. As you know, this is a bipartisan health and safety concern in the western U.S., and particularly in a state like mine where there are at least 900 known abandoned hard rock mines within 100 square miles of the Spring Mountains. Can you just talk about how this will assist us in dealing with abandoned mines?
I'll do my best. Earth MRI is not my area of expertise, but I do know from my colleagues that mineral exploration is hampered due to lack of adequate geological, geophysical, and topographic data. These data can be used for not only identifying areas of potential for critical minerals, but also identifying and characterizing legacy hard rock sites.
Is there any other expert who wants to comment on this? No. Okay, but thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nassar, I'm going to continue on this theme that you've heard from a number of us this morning, and I want to talk about helium specifically. As you know, the Biden administration removed helium from the critical minerals list. Helium is vital to our economy, including in defense, semiconductors, healthcare, and more, and there's also a well-documented shortage of helium. In fact, Gary Stanley, the director of the Office of Materials Industries at the Commerce Department in 2021 stated, "You can see helium is at the center when you look at the medical side, climate change, healthcare, the whole area of the U.S. economic growth and recovery from COVID-19. We see that helium is one of the most critical minerals that can be seen at the center of that conversation." Shortly after that, in February 22, the Biden administration removed helium from the critical minerals list. Given the Commerce Department's comments, can you please explain why helium was removed?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. One of the key factors that we look at is import dependence, net import dependence. And the United States is the world's largest producer of helium. It has been for a long time, and a net exporter of helium. That is the main reason it was taken off the critical minerals list.
There is a well-documented shortage of helium. Can you explain why helium was taken off the list?
Yes, sir, I believe those are commercial issues. The fact of the matter remains is that the U.S. is a net exporter of helium, producing significantly larger quantities of helium that consumes domestically.
So I think you're sensing a brain freeze from a lot of us up here that your definition of a critical mineral has a lot to do with supply chain, and I would disagree with you on the availability. All of those things can be disrupted and changed in moments. So how is it that things can be critical and not be critical?
I think the issue is definitional. I think critical is a word that I often try not to use because it gets conflated for that reason. It gets conflated with the word of importance. I think there's no doubt that helium and basically every mineral commodity is important to somebody, right? What we're looking at is trying to understand what is the supply risk to the entire U.S. economy, and that's how we do the analysis. And for commodities for which we are a net exporter, we are dependent on domestic sources for those commodities.
Okay. But yes, we're a net exporter, but we have a shortage. We don't have enough.
My understanding is that based on the USGS estimates of reserves, there's 8.5 billion cubic meters of helium reserves. That's not all there is. That's just the reserves that are known. So there's significant supply for decades, if not centuries, of helium.
All right, we're going to agree to disagree on that. Mr. Summers, you and I understand Utah well and the mining industry. I'd like to kind of have you opine for a minute on this concept that we talk about a lot, that somehow it's okay to seek these minerals in other countries where we don't see and hear some of the human rights, some of the standards, some of the emission standards that are implied. I think, is it fair to say that's viewed hypocritically sometimes in the state? And can you kind of explain how that feels to our U.S. miners in the United States and in Utah?
Absolutely. With your indulgence, Mr. Curtis, I'd actually like to talk about the helium for a second.
Please, I should have started with that, but please jump in. Yeah.
Again, with your indulgence, most of the helium targets in Utah are in your district, as you know.
Right.
And we actually had been seeing quite a bit of exploration activity around potential helium development, and most of that is frozen up. And my understanding is that a large reason for that is, one, because of the reestablishment of the expansion of the Bears Ears National Monument, which is very close to many of those helium targets, and then also because of litigation. Many of the helium targets that have been looked at in your district have been the subject of litigation almost preemptively. So to your other point, I do think that it's very hypocritical when we can mine these commodities much better and more environmentally friendly, with regard to labor protections, with regard to technological innovation here in the U.S. better than they can do it in foreign places. And it's always baffling to me that many people will drive across town for a fair trade coffee bean, but their car is full of cobalt that's been come from child miners in the Congo, and it's just not acceptable.
Another way to say that, and unfortunately we're almost out of time, is this body literally controls every aspect of the way that's mined in Utah and in the United States, and we have zero control on how that's mined overseas.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm regrettably out of time. I yield back.
And to the gentleman, don't forget helium-4 and its new ideas about fission. So,
Thank you.
The gentleman from Michigan, Ms. Dingle, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is focused on critical minerals, which we all know is critical and essential for our transition to the clean energy economy and electric vehicle manufacturing, which I know my colleagues on the other side love. But my home state of Michigan is home to a major hub for electric vehicle manufacturing, which is why I am entirely focused on ensuring the United States has the capacity to reach our full potential when it comes to the build-out of electric vehicles for both jobs and the climate. The Inflation Reduction Act changed the requirements for electric vehicle tax credits for consumers, requiring either assembly in North America or at least 40% of the value of critical minerals used for the vehicle to be extracted, processed, and or recycled domestically or in a country that the U.S. has a fair trade agreement with. So I have a question for you, Dr. Mulvaney. We know that current laws for domestic mining have not been meaningfully updated in over 150 years. And that has tipped the scales towards mining companies and away from the communities who want to have a fair say in the decision-making if we're going to build a strong, enduring mining industry in the United States, especially one that's going to fit the needs to meet the vehicles of the future. So, Dr. Mulvaney, can you expand on why it's essential that we reform the mining law of 1872 as we build a sustainable domestic supply chain for electric vehicles?
Thank you for the question. I noted in reading some of the testimony that the mining law is older than the USGS, which I think it's worth pointing out. So Native Americans in particular, I think, have borne the brunt of the negative impacts of mining across the United States, and that's partly due to the proximity of mining developments, and I think it's something like 600,000 Native Americans live within 6 miles of an abandoned mine, and that usually has implications for groundwater and other things. If we were to try to think about a new reform around mining, cleaning up some of these legacy wastes, I think would be one area to focus on, raising revenues to do that. I think we don't raise enough money for those kinds of things, and those the taxpayer ends up paying for a lot of the mine waste cleanup at the end of the day. And as the ranking member pointed out in the opening remarks, a lot of these clean tech minerals are also very close to Native American communities. So ensuring that they get the benefits and don't have the burdens from this transition, I think, are also really critically important there. And then I guess
I'm going to ask you to cut because I want to get to him. I would like to have you maybe expand on this because I think we need to have a sustainable supply. That's something we all want to work on. But Dr. Nasser, we also know that mining is not always the risk factor for minerals on the critical minerals list. Sometimes we do have sustainable supplies from allied countries, but things like processing are the issue. Dr. Nasser, can you expand on how often mining is the bottleneck of our critical minerals versus other stops along the supply chain?
Thank you for that question. Mineral commodities supply chains, of course, begin with mining. Actually, one could argue that they begin with exploration and having good geological data. However, what we have seen in our data analysis is that more often than not, the middle of the supply chain is where production becomes extremely concentrated. For example, China does not dominate lithium or cobalt mining, but it does refining. And we assess supply chain risk at multiple supply chain stages and identify the bottlenecks for that purpose.
Thank you. Dr. Mulvaney, in the short period left, can you give us, in your perspective, what are some more of the sustainable ways to address these issues, and what are the economic and social benefits of these approaches, including job creation? And maybe you can do more for the record later.
Yeah, I'll just highlight a life cycle approach, I think, is key because there are lots of opportunities to recover from waste. And I think community benefits and early engagement with communities will help make projects be more socially acceptable and better and more sustainable in the long run. So more collaborative approaches to mine development instead of the approach that we use today, which is what we call decide, announce, defend.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So reading your testimony, Dr. Mulvaney, I take it that you view the permitting process as not burdensome at all here in the United States of America for mineral and natural resources projects that use natural resources.
If you're specifically talking about the National Environmental Policy Act review process, then yes. That's the part of the permitting process that I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, and you don't view that as burdensome?
I do not.
Yeah. It says in here, the reality is the time to permit a hard rock mine is 2 years according to the GAO. What do you tell Congressman Stauber about the mine that has taken 17 years in his district?
I'm not familiar with that mine, and I would love to learn more about that because that sounds like it's out of the bounds that I typically hear.
Yeah, you said in regards to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that great example of how our projects can be built on time. Are you familiar with the Cardinal Hickory line that is supposed to be bringing so-called renewable energy from Iowa into Wisconsin and how it's delayed?
I'm not familiar with that one, no.
Yeah, you should take a look at that because I don't think your testimony is accurate. In regards to, that's one project that's supposedly going to bring renewable energy in. Isn't it correct recycling is a net energy loser? Hasn't there been detailed studies that have been done that have shown that really recycling is a net energy loser between all the trucks that we run on roads and stuff like that, that we actually end up using more hydrocarbons as a result of recycling.
I can see certain circumstances where there might be net energy losses in certain systems, but in general, I do not think that that's true. I think recycling is a net energy winner in most cases.
Yeah, I'd urge you to review some of the documentation out there, and in particular, I'd point you to a fellow Californian who's in academia, Stephen Hayward, and see some of the work that he has done. I see you're in the College of Social Sciences. Are all the hard sciences at San Jose State University housed in the Social Sciences Department?
No.
Okay. So, Dr. Nasser.
Our department has gone back and forth between natural sciences and social sciences because we're in an interdisciplinary department.
Dr. Nasser, very good chart here in regards to supply risk. What's the one consistent thing above the line there that we all see in regards to all these minerals, especially trace minerals? What's the one consistent thing that we see there on the right side of the chart in terms of supply risk?
I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but I would imagine that you're referring to the largest producer being China?
Yeah, the largest producer and refiner is China. Does that bring you any pause?
That is definitely of concern, and the reason why we do the analysis that we do in terms of understanding which countries may be not reliable trade partners going forward.
You know, Mr. Chairman, as we debate the Department of Defense budget here this week, it is very clear that this is as big a national security concern as you can possibly have, is to look at for those of you that have not studied the chart, take a look at it really closely, leading producing countries, both production and refinery. Dr. Eggert, has the United States of America done a better job of mitigating risk in regards to mining over the last 100 years?
I would say it's a mixed bag. I think we are more aware of the issues and the problems now, but there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, but do you believe that we've gotten better about mitigating that risk?
Well, I think a lot of risk mitigation occurs in the private entities that are directly focused on supply chain risks, the companies that use the materials for the products that they manufacture and use.
Well, specifically in regards to mining, because I think about there were no environmental protections put in place when I think about the mining district that's north of me in the community of Hurley and then Ironwood, Michigan, and now you could never build a mine like that.
It is correct, obviously, that there's a lot more to mining law than the mining law itself. Certainly, environmental rules have grown up around the mining law, and there's room for improvement in the permitting processes and related activities.
One quick question to Mr. Summers. Did I hear you say that the USGS has downgraded potash? I came in right when you were giving your testimony. Could you give us some detail on what's going on there?
Yeah, correct. In the 22 list, the 2022 list, potash was removed as a critical mineral. And then, as I mentioned in my testimony, you know, this was 2 days after Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and Russia and Belarus supply about 41% of the global potash commodity that we have. And so that has a resulting increase in fertilizer prices and availability around the world.
Yeah, isn't potash a critical element for farmers to be able to grow crops?
Correct.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. So in order for the United States to remain competitive in this century, we must have access to a reliable supply of critical minerals that are vital to our national security, our energy independence, and our economy. These minerals are used in consumer electronics, in our phones, in our cars, and also found in Rhode Island in some of our most important economic sectors. General Dynamics Electric Boat at Quonset Point in my district builds Virginia-class submarines, which need large quantities of rare earth minerals. Offshore wind turbines like we have in Block Island and like we are rolling out as part of the Revolution offshore wind project also require mineral inputs, just to use some examples. The Energy Act of 2020 requires the Department of Interior to review and update the list of critical minerals, update the methodology used to identify potential critical minerals, and accept feedback from the public every 3 years. This legislation, along with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, helps strengthen the U.S. supply chain for critical minerals. The U.S. Geological Survey is at the center of this work and is entrusted with developing a framework for understanding which of these resources is most vulnerable to disruption and forecasting short-term and long-term trends based on the data. Dr. Nasser, since the passage of the Energy Act of 2020, can you explain how USGS's methodology has evolved and changed?
Yes, I would be happy to, Congressman. So the initial methodology examined two factors quantitatively. We looked at net import reliance and production concentration, regardless of where the production was taking place. In the updated methodology, after the passage of the Energy Act of 2020, we modified that indicator by taking into account country factors. So production concentrated in Canada and Australia don't get the same rating as production concentrated in Russia or China. Going forward, we are moving towards having a more economic impacts model where we're able to understand and quantify the impact that a certain supply disruption scenario may have, not only consuming industries, but downstream industries and the economy overall.
And it was alluded to in one of the prior members' remarks that, you know, there's a lot of political pressure around which minerals are on this list or not, and a lot of stakeholders that you know, approach your organization to lobby for inclusion versus not. So can you speak, how are you able to insulate the process from political pressure so that this is truly based on empirical data, based on sort of a rational analysis of the facts, and not political pressure or lobbying?
Thank you again for that question, Congressman. The USGS is a federal science agency, and as part of our fundamental science practices, USGS analyses and reports go through multiple layers of review and approval, including peer review. The critical minerals list methodology went through, in addition to the internal review process, went through an external review process in a peer-reviewed journal. In addition to that, we performed, as required by the Energy Act, an interagency working group that reviewed the analysis and the methodology and had a chance to review the results before its release.
Thank you. So I've heard some of my colleagues from the other side intimate that because there are critical minerals found in clean energy development, that means that we should pump the brakes on rolling out clean energy to turn the reverse climate change and protect our environment, that we should stop building windmills, stop building solar panels. Interestingly, I don't hear them saying the same thing about cell phones and cars and other products that use critical minerals. But I was wondering, Mr. Mulvaney, if you could just, at a high level, say, is scarcity of critical minerals a reason that we should pump the brakes and not move forward on transitioning to clean energy and fighting climate change?
No, it's a good reason to take a life cycle approach to thinking in a circular economy approach to recovering these materials.
Yeah, and on that, and I know you spoke to this earlier, but I think this is an important point. In addition to sourcing these critical minerals, we need to be focused on recycling them and using them efficiently because they are scarce. So with the time we have left, could you just reiterate what are some of the things that we as Congress should be doing to promote the recycling of critical minerals?
What makes recycling typically work is the reverse logistics. So you need take-back and collection systems. You need comprehensive take-back and collection system to recover all of the electrical equipment, because every bit of electrical equipment has some copper in it somewhere, or aluminum. So we really need to be focused on making sure that those materials don't end up in the landfill and end up in new products.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman that is the chairman for the full committee, Mr. Westerman from Arkansas, to recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar, and thank you again to the witnesses. Dr. Nasser, in 2018, the critical minerals list, USGS in the list, USGS included uranium despite it having both fuel and non-fuel uses, saying that input from other agencies emphasized uranium's important non-fuel uses. Then Director Fortier defended the decision to include uranium when he testified before this committee in 2019, listing the important non-fuel uses of uranium, including radiation shields, counterweights, and armor-piercing kinetic energy penetrators, as well as medical applications such as medical isotope production. However, uranium was noticeably absent from the updated list under this administration. The explanation for this cited uranium fuels uses as the disqualifying factor. I sent Secretary Holland a letter on this issue in February of 2022 before the new critical minerals list was finalized, asking DOI to consider its decision to list uranium as military tensions in Eastern Europe came to a head, and unfortunately that request was denied. I'd like to submit that letter to the record. So what led USGS and its consulting agencies to change its mind about the importance of uranium's non-fuel uses and choose to not evaluate it as a critical mineral for the recent list?
Thank you for that question. I think what's changed is that the Energy Act was passed, and the Energy Act defines critical minerals as non-fuel and specifically excludes fuel minerals, and thus USGS did not evaluate uranium.
That seems to have changed since 2019 because it was, it's always had fuel and non-fuel uses. So were there other factors involved?
No, sir. The uses maybe have not changed, but the definition of what uranium is labeled as, is it a fuel mineral or not its uses.
Yeah, that just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me why it would be taken off the list after such a strong argument for it being on the list. That's why it's important for us to have these hearings and to come up with better policy moving forward. Mr. Summers, just yesterday, the Department of the Interior released the report from the Interagency Working Group on mining reforms. I will say I was obviously very disappointed, but not surprised to hear of several extremely harmful recommendations to change our domestic mining system, despite lip service about increasing mining for the administration's renewable goals. How harmful would these changes be to investment in a mining state with large amounts of federal land such as yours?
It would be incredibly damaging. So especially the idea of changing into a leasing system and the idea of royalties, which according to the proposal would be among the highest in the world, would be absolutely devastating to the hard rock mining industry.
Yeah, and we've seen what appears to be an attack on mining all around this country. At the same time, we see China dominating mining and mineral resources, and we also see policies that are making us more dependent on those minerals and elements that China produces. So as we talk about being more energy independent, as we talk about having more national security, it seems that reports like this one that came out yesterday fly right in the face of that. It's one thing to talk the talk, but we're not walking the walk in this administration.
Yeah, and I think you've seen that on a number of fronts. I mean, the latest report is one piece of evidence there. I mean, mineral withdrawals that we've seen all around the country. These are things that are very problematic to enable us to develop the mineral resources that we have that can lessen our dependence on places like China.
Right. It seems like it should just be common sense. Dr. Eggert, could you explain to your knowledge the real-world benefits, if any, of a commodity being designated as a critical mineral, and how does this compare to being designated as a critical material by DOE?
In my view, designation as a critical mineral or material shines a spotlight on the material or mineral overall. In terms of policy implications, I think one needs to then ask the question more narrowly: what is the narrower context of that particular supply chain, the technologies and products it's used in, and what the various policy mechanisms are. In terms of mineral versus material, I think it reflects, well, many people use the term synonymously. For those who focus on one or the other, I think it relates to the portion of the supply chain that is most prominent in a person's perspective. Critical mineral tends to be used by entities, people who have an upstream focus more than downstream, relatively speaking, and vice versa. So to me, it's not surprising that the USGS activity is critical mineral, whereas the Department of Energy activity is labeled critical material. But to me, they're all part of the same thing, and they really mean the same thing to me.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the chairman. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of the witnesses for your time today. My district in California, the San Francisco Bay Area, is home to many companies working on emerging technologies to advance the clean energy transition. The mineral supply chain will become increasingly important as they continue to work towards that transition. So my question is for Dr. Mulvaney. In your testimony, you discuss how advances in technology can help us create innovative sources of critical minerals. And apologies if you've touched on this already, maybe multiple times, but could you elaborate on some of the latest innovations and advancements in things like developing a circular economy, improving recycling and material substitutions, and then specifically what can Congress do to help encourage these innovative approaches?
Well, I'll start with the second part to that, which piggybacks on my previous comment about setting up a take-back and collection system, because that really sends a signal to the recyclers and the innovators who are working with these materials that there's going to be a market for them to recover that material and sell it back to a new product. So, for example, having content requirements, having a certain percentage of recycled content as a law or policy can help drive innovation in those new emerging sectors. We are seeing, because of the European Union's Waste and Electronics and Electrical Equipment Directive, a take-back and collection system is leading to 95% of solar panels being recovered in Europe. They're getting silver out of them. They're innovating to get the silicon, which is very, very high energy intensity and most carbon-intensive part of the solar panel. They're recovering that. And in the United States, it's less than 10%. It's on the order of 5% because we don't have that take-back and collection system. We are also innovating around battery materials. We're starting to see sodium batteries entering into cars in China. It's a very small car, just, burgeoning industry. We don't know if sodium batteries will be the future, but that's part of, I think, what we have to be aware of is that sometimes these materials that we demand will change in the future.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Russ, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the panel, thank you for being here and your participation. And you're probably aware of this, but in the wisdom of Congress, we have multiple committees going on at the same time. So if you see us coming and going, please forgive for the scheduling on that. But thank you for being here. A question for Mr. Nasser. This has to do with uranium. And I know that in your written testimony you touched on this, but I'd like to just clarify, get your thoughts. Uranium is used, of course, for nuclear power plants, and that's a specific interest to me in my state. Idaho National Lab is instrumental in research for nuclear power, and our availability for that, our resources for that, are primarily outside of the U.S. And so I want to just have you talk for a minute about what are your concerns when it comes to domestic production? What are the issues there? And is there a reason why, from a policy standpoint, we don't have more of that domestic sourcing?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. As a science agency, I obviously wouldn't be able to comment on policy issues. But what we are concerned with and what our analysis draws upon are supply risks due to three factors that we look at. We look at the likelihood of a disruption, our exposure, meaning the United States exposure to foreign supply disruptions, and our ability to weather the storm through our economic vulnerability to those disruptions. And so those are the factors that we look at. And in terms of disruption potential, we are looking at whether or not the suppliers to the United States are reliable suppliers, whether there will be potential for a disruption due to the simple fact that the production is concentrated either in one trading partner or in a geographic region. So those are the things that concern us most.
So right now, how much of our current supply comes from domestic sources? Can you tell me that?
It really depends by commodity. For some commodities like molybdenum, we are net exporters. For other commodities like gallium, we are importing 100%.
I'm talking specifically about uranium in this case.
Uranium. Our center doesn't necessarily cover uranium production and consumption, but my understanding is that we are highly net import reliant. Most of our imports are coming in currently from Australia and a smaller degree from Canada.
That brings up another question. Why is that? Why is uranium not of interest to you? And you say that's not covered by your jurisdiction. Why not?
Sorry, I believe that is due to a statute that requires the Energy Information Administration to cover uranium and not the National Minerals Information Center at the U.S. Geological Survey.
Okay. So, but your understanding is that we are highly reliant outside of the U.S.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. Mr. Eggert, I'd like to talk to you for just a second, please. Idaho provides a significant amount of phosphate that is used for fertilizer and other products, and that's important for domestic food production and other uses. There are 2 phosphate mines in my state, in Idaho, and both of those are put at risk currently due to some lawsuits and other issues. The Department of Interior did not include phosphate on its list of critical minerals in 2022. It has been previously, but it wasn't as of 2022. So if we lost domestic production of phosphate, do you think that would trigger that being put on a critical mineral list?
I would expect so. The phosphate clearly is essential for fertilizer and in turn agricultural production. The United States is currently a major producer of phosphate rock and phosphorus for fertilizers, and if we lost domestic production capabilities, that would certainly elevate its ranking in any list of or evaluation of material criticality.
So if there was we've got about 35% of our dependence on that from combination of China and Russia. So, and then just the local stock is in danger of being shut down with current litigation standards. So have you tracked that? Do you see a danger of supply shock given our susceptibility to those circumstances?
I don't have detailed knowledge of that particular circumstance, but it sounds worthy of evaluation.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to follow up with Mr. Eggert on that at a later point, and I've used my time, so I yield back. Thank you.
Sounds good. The gentleman from Arizona, the ranking member for the full committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I forget, Mr. Summers, if I may, on the issue of royalties, and you commented on it, the interagency working group recommended, I think, proposed a 4 to 8% royalty on net revenue from a mining operation. You still believe that that's an excessive amount?
Yeah, again, that would put us among the highest royalties in the world if that were to be implemented.
Interesting, because the state of Utah on their state land charges 4 to 10% on gross revenue, not the net revenue part of it, and which I would suggest makes Utah the highest royalty charging government entity in the world, other than the federal government. So it's how do you reconcile that? Is that fair for taxpayers from public lands, federal lands, cannot draw royalties from mining operations regardless, and yet a state, Utah, Wyoming does the same thing, Arizona does the same thing, can charge royalties on state land. Do you think that that's fair?
Well, and again, I'm not sure exactly which royalty rate you're referring to, Mr. Grijalva, but in some cases...
Since there is none on federal land, any royalty rate you want. Whether, I mean, it's... Anyway, finish your response, apologies.
Yeah, so again, I'm not sure exactly which royalty rate you're referring to. It does differ by commodity in Utah, and those are set by the State and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, which administers a trust on behalf of Utah school children. And I think that the issue here is not necessarily that the mining industry is opposed to any type of royalty rate. It's just a matter of how that royalty rate is applied and the overall rate as well.
The fact we have none does open that conversation on many levels, from cleanup of abandoned mines to reclamation to sureties for communities and for tribes in the area in terms of the impact and effects of a particular mining operation after they leave after 25, 30 years. So, you know, I think it's a legitimate point. That's part of the problem with the 150-year-old mining law. You know, the critical minerals list informs decisions across the federal government. In my district, the Permitting Council recently announced the first ever mining project approved for Fast 41, a process where these covered projects receive expedited permitting and review. The mine was chosen because the minerals are on the critical minerals list. But my constituents have concerns. The critical mineral list may tell us all about the mineral's importance to the economy, but it doesn't capture the impacts of mining on local communities, local economies, the environment, of cultural heritage. And compound that with the constituents being concerned about the already extremely scarce water supplies and that this mine would draw upon, and the huge water users would dry up. In fact, some parts of the state, residential construction is being paused, stopped, because there isn't enough groundwater to support the new developments. My point being, while there are critical minerals in this location, how do you balance and weigh water supplies, endangered species, and cultural heritage, tribal consultation, and executing our trust responsibility to tribes? Dr. Nasser, are any of these factors considered when you're looking at the critical minerals?
Thank you, Congressman. Those are not factors that we look at. However, in our Earth mapping resource initiatives, USGS follows Department of Interior guidelines regarding tribal engagement and only collects data over tribal lands with express written consent. We also
my
follow.
point being, I mean, we're talking about specific the sovereignty part of it, but the consultation is any project that impacts, and I think that's the answer is no. And Dr. Mulvaney, going into the future mine permitting, these factors need to be taken into account from my perspective. Your response to that? And there's other factors, I just mentioned those three.
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, how do you think the future mine permitting should take these factors into account going forward?
It needs to, first, that life cycle approach that I started with, it needs to be more holistic. There needs to be alternatives considered, and that could be even through the National Environmental Policy Act. Sometimes there's alternatives considered there, and there also needs to be more cumulative impacts looked at, because we're often permitting projects one by one, and we don't see the big picture. And that's what I meant when I said a holistic approach, by understanding, you know, cumulative impacts. You know, a mine might be proposed, it might say it's not going to impact groundwater, but we don't know what else is coming down the line. And I think it's important.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing the witness.
I thank the gentleman. I'm going to recognize myself now for the next one. Dr. Mulvaney, you made a comment to Mr. Tiffany in regards to power, in regards to recycling. I think you really need to check your information. It takes much more power to recycle something than it does new. So that's whether it be paper wood, whether it be minerals, all the way across the board. Number two, can you name me a mine that you actually endorse and support?
I'll answer the first question, a second question first. I live next to a sand mine in Ben Lomond, California, and I would support
How about a hard rock mine? How about a hard rock mine?
I actually don't know of any hard rock mines where I've lived near, so I don't know.
It seems to me like you should be looking at that hard rock mine and getting familiar with it if you're going to be an expert along these critical minerals, because it's so very, very important. Dr. Egger, I got to tell you, thanks for Colorado School of Mines. My dad and my sister went there, so thank you very much for that excellent education we got. I want to come back to uranium. I find it offensive that it's taken off, this critical mineral list, because now we're seeing, I was in Germany a couple years back with Rob Bishop, and our military is supposed to have 24/7 baseload power. And they were going to use Nord Stream 2. And so my comment was, well, we're going to use this 24-hour baseload power coming from Russia. How does that work? And here we're doing the same thing again, where almost everybody that talks about green energy says you can't do it without nuclear right now. Take a quantum leap in battery storage to get this taken care of. So we're going down this rat hole again about energy and being dictated by adversaries. Would you consider Russia a friend, Dr. Egger?
Under the current circumstances, no, I would not consider Russia an ally.
And how did that switch flip? Was it very quick, that geopolitical switch? Didn't it flip very quickly?
Oh, absolutely. I think for the last several decades, we, generally speaking, have viewed engagement with Russia as a means of, over the longer term, fostering greater security through more interactions. And what has happened came as a surprise.
So I also want to go back to Mr. Fulcher. He talked about helium. Now, it was I thought I saw this, that it was helium-4 that was used in a fusion experiment. Was that true? Mr. Egger? Dr. Egger?
I believe so. I'm not an expert on helium.
I guess coming along those same lines as Mr. Fulcher, to Dr. Nasser, this ought to be on the critical list, because my understanding is helium-4 just doesn't be everywhere. Now, Dr. Egger, when we're doing science discoveries and experiments, a critical element could be just anything that we need to have to place in there. But if you don't have it, you can't use it. Is that true? If you don't have that element, you can't use it.
If you don't have it, you cannot use it, correct?
Wow. It seems like all this technology is going down these roads with helium and nuclear and critical and hard rock. It's just amazing how much things we have not taken into consideration here. It's very, very sad. Mr. Summers, here is your answer to the gentleman from Arizona. In the multiple-use doctrine, Congress gave the state the hard rock royalty as part of that aspect. Like in Arizona, the state is the last of jurisdiction because we were rejected the first time. The second time they came back with Taft. Taft was the only president to go to the Supreme Court. So he understood contracts. So we were forced to take the multiple use, or take the federal doctrine of the federal lands. But in lieu of that, we were given the multiple use doctrine that the Fed said they would get the maximum out of it to appease both sides. So hard rock mining went to the state. I find it very offensive that I look at my district. We just had the ranking member and the interior secretary come into my state and withdraw over 1 million acres. Not for the maintaining the landscape. It was to stop uranium production. And if you look at this, it is an unhealthy situation when you do not mine it. The breccia pipes, the collapsed breccia pipe, is a low point in the geology. I used to hate rocks, Dr. Egger. Now I love rocks. It sets you free. And so water pools there and in the air, and so you're going to get contamination all the way across. Seems to me like what you'd want to do is take out that uranium, clean it up, have sand and gravel put in there. It helps you through the caliche clays, so you get subpermeation of water. That was a mouthful. Sorry. The gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Bobert, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today and testifying before our committee. Mr. Blakemore, clearly China is dominating the entire world when it comes to mineral supply chains, but why is that? Why are we so desperately far behind the curve when it comes to China and these rare earth minerals?
It's a combination of multiple factors. First and foremost, China embarked on a aggressive strategy of investing in upstream resources abroad, right? And those investments drew a lot of those resources domestically to China, where it was able to construct a pretty strong market share on the processing part of key supply chains. Facilitated also by high subsidization and in some cases rather lax environmental regulation. That's gotten us to the point now where China's market incumbency both puts it ahead of the United States in terms of certain supply chain resiliency efforts, but also makes reducing that market incumbency a little bit sticky given the economics associated with those respective supply chains.
Do you think that the President Trump administration, his executive orders in 2017 that were proposed steps to form a national strategy to strengthen our domestic supply chains, do you think that would have helped in this and so we wouldn't be so far behind the curve?
I think the efforts more broadly by over the course of several administrations actually have advanced a more holistic approach to thinking about our supply chain resiliency. The Trump administration, to its credit, did a lot of work to think specifically about upstream resiliency. However, upstream resiliency alone is not a solution to supply chain resiliency, right? And I think as our thinking and strategic planning around supply chain resiliency matures, moving down the supply chain as well and thinking about the on-take and off-take of various components of the supply chain to build that strategy is also necessary. So I look at the Trump administration decision as one piece, a critical piece, but one piece of what I would call a healthy supply chain resiliency strategy.
Thank you. It sounds like we would agree that the way the United States determines what is considered a critical mineral and how we manage these supply chains and what production advantages, if any, listed critical minerals we receive over unlisted mineral commodities is of national importance. Dr. Eggert, you have been involved in critical mineral and material assessments for decades, and it seems that these assessments have helped highlight some of the challenges that we're facing. But are we, as a nation, making headway in improving our situation with respect to critical minerals?
I think we are making improvements, but there's always room for more improvement. I think in terms of three specific areas where we should focus attention. First, research and development throughout the entire supply chain. Second, workforce development. It takes workers to mine the minerals and do the various downstream processing activities, and we've lost much of that capability. And third, there's significant room for improvement in permitting and associated pre-production activities, not to minimize or reduce the importance of environmental protection or interaction with local communities, but in a way that gets us to yes or no, and how, in terms of project development sooner.
Thank you. And Mr. Summers, to me it seems that this administration says one thing about mining in America, but does something completely different. They do another thing. Has the critical materials list yielded any results in terms of creating jobs or economic development in your state? We just heard that one improvement to the supply chain and this energy security would be to improve the workforce.
Yeah, I do think that there's utility in highlighting the supply chain vulnerabilities that we have, but in terms of bringing specific investment or jobs to the state because a mineral is on the list or not on the list, we haven't seen that in Utah. And I think that the bigger issues are some of the other things that we've talked about. I mean, it's what's the federal government's policy, especially in a public land state like Utah. What are the federal government's policies with regard to how you can open up and permit and develop a mine? And then also, is the federal government going to come in and make the economics of a mining project more difficult because of royalty rates or other things that they might be contemplating? So I think that those are the more important issues as opposed to whether a mineral's on a list or not.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, may I ask one yes or no question, Mr. Somers?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So has the Biden administration's decision to leave out critical minerals like uranium and helium on the list had any adverse impacts on job creation or economic development? And you can expand later, but maybe just for now, yes or no?
I think that it has, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all of you and your time here today. I yield.
Thank you very much. Our next representative question is Representative Collins. You're up for 5.
I think that was pretty obvious there, Mr. Chairman. No, I'm just joking. I kind of want to point my questions in one direction, but listening for most of the questions and testimony, except for when the time, obviously you've been seeing us run in and out like Fulcher was talking about. But I've noticed that people have been asking about certain minerals and being on the list, off the list, on the list of critical minerals. And then having gone all over the country, just with field hearings that we've been involved with to talk to people about how it's impacting their lives, their families' lives, and generational lives of people that mine. And I kind of want to, you may have answered it, I don't know. And maybe I just didn't get it. I've tried to take some notes. But Dr. Nasser, I just want to kind of go over a few things real quick to just get an idea in my simple little brain of process and methodology maybe. And so how does the USGS determine a country's ability to supply mineral resources? And how did you decide on that methodology that you're using?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. So I think you're specifically asking regarding the country metrics.
Yeah.
Yes. So we look at 2 factors: a country's ability to supply to the United States, continue to supply to the United States, and a country's willingness to continue to supply to the United States. For the ability metric, we use the Fraser Institute's Policy Perception Index, which is a survey to mining executives around the world to rank countries and jurisdictions regarding how favorable are policies, how favorable are how's the political situation, political stability of the country, access to labor, access to infrastructure, access to electricity, for example. And so that's the basis for the ability metric. For the willingness metric, we look at 3 factors: how close a country is ideologically to the United States, do they have democratic practices or not. We look also trade ties. So how closely are the 2 countries, that country in question and the United States in terms of trade? And we also look at military cooperation. Is there a specific defense agreement for supplying the United States? So those are the factors that we look at in terms of country metrics.
Okay, and maybe that'll help with this next question that I've got for you. Because I understand you do consult with other agencies, including the Department of Defense and the Department of State when you draft your critical minerals list. So how much weight do you give those consulting departments when you make your final decision?
Sorry, if I can get a clarification, are you asking how much weight do we give
those departments when you're making your final decision, when they have their input?
Right. So through the interagency process, through the National Science Technology Council's Critical Subcommittee, we formed a working group. They weighed in on the methodology throughout the process. They weighed in on the results at the end of it. We also did an internal peer review within USGS and an external peer review with experts at a scientific journal.
So how do you even put a value on the importance of their opinion when they have totally different priorities?
Well, I think we take in all the comments. This is an iterative process where we hear each other, we understand the issues of importance to them, and we weigh the factors together.
Okay.
Mr. Collins, can I follow up real quick? I'll give you the time back.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Nasser, so you weigh other departments, their needs and wants and desires. So does politics then enter it?
I apologize. Let me clarify. What I was saying is that we take input from people within the departments in terms of the methodology. Do they feel like this specific methodological input makes sense or not? So they are part of the interagency working group to help us define the methodology.
I yield back to the gentleman from Georgia, and I'll give you your time back as well. Thank you.
That's okay. I only have one other question I wanted to run by him. Have you ever considered making subcategories of minerals on the list by sector or end use, such as defense or aeronautics, similar to the way the critical mineral list at the DOE focuses on alternative energy?
Thank you for that question. I think it is an interesting proposal. The way we see it is that it's important to look at the economy as a whole, because if you look at one individual industry, sector, or technology, then you might be missing compounding or second-order effects that might impact each other. So it's important for us to look at the economy as a whole, and in our future development of the methodology, we are planning to use an economic model that is able to measure and quantify those impacts, not only on those directly consuming industries, but downstream industries, again, and the economy as a whole.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I want to thank the witnesses for the valuable testimony, the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Monday, September 18th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.